Thank you, Professor Bean. Am I being heard? Is that okay? Thank you. Well, I hope you have just a little bit of energy left for one more paper. And this is going to be about Epiphany in the report to Greco, or Eklάμψης του νου, as Professor Haralambakis just mentioned. Nikos Kazantzakis' report to Greco, the novel of his own life, as Peter Bean fittingly characterized it, traces the journey of its central character, who is named after the author himself, through the private, public, and aesthetic/eschatological phases of vocation. Like other novels in the tradition of aesthetic autobiography within which the report falls, it delineates a journey dotted by a sequence of predicaments of personal, existential, religious, and creative nature, which occasionally verge on what might be called a crisis. Of all the predicaments conveyed in the report, the religious predicament, from which the character called Kazantzakis suffers, appears to be the most acute, prolonged, and hard to heal. Manifesting itself over an extended period of time, it takes the form of a mild religious crisis when Kazantzakis' psychic pendulum swings towards skepticism, uncertainty, and doubt, as opposed to a full religious crisis when he loses his faith in Orthodox Christianity altogether. In chapter 13 of the report, we find out that Kazantzakis lost his faith whilst at high school when he was taught about Copernicus and Darwin's theory of evolution by the professor of physics. According to the report again, before the adolescent Kazantzakis became a convert of the new religion of evolution, trying to convert others, his fatal encounter with Darwin's theory threw him into a state of emotional turmoil, marked by lingering feelings of disappointment, bitterness, frustration, exasperation, and existential agony, soon to be followed by insomnia, isolation from his social surroundings, and acts of mild debauchery. All these intense psychophysical symptoms reported to have been felt by the adolescent Kazantzakis can be construed as typical symptoms of a religious crisis experienced by a young, keen believer who suddenly, almost violently, becomes disenchanted with God. Nonetheless, at this point, the adolescent Kazantzakis cannot help suffering, even mourning over the prospect of a godless universe, precisely because this prospect divests his life of the meaning with which it had been previously invested. It would not be an exaggeration to claim that throughout his life, both the real and the fictional, Kazantzakis sought to heal the wound, or trauma in the psychoanalytic jargon, inflicted in his sensitive adolescent soul by Copernicus's theory and by Darwin's theory of evolution. Healing the trauma would mean that he would be able to find and reinvest his life with new meaning. The solutions found by the real Kazantzakis to temporarily reinvest his life with meaning and thus alleviate, though alas never completely heal, the deep wound inflicted in his psyche by his early disenchantment with God and by his ensuing loss of faith, range from the adoption of science and paganism to return to Orthodox Christianity, through the embracing of communism, which evolved into a meta-communist credo, to a self-fashioned meta-Christian theory of evolution. In the report, though, where Kazantzakis fashions a transubstantiated version of his life with the help of his mythopoetic imagination and the assistance of such literary models as Goethe's Dichtung und Wahrheit, the balms employed to temporarily alleviate his wound are adjusted to the needs of the aesthetic autobiography. In the report, Kazantzakis employs Epiphany as an antidote to redeem himself not only from his religious predicament and the crisis and the following crisis, but also from his personal, existential, and creative predicaments. In so doing, he sides with the fictional protagonists of Wordsworth's The Prelude, Proust's In Search of Lost Time, and Joyce's A Portrait of the Artist as a Young Man, to name some of the most celebrated characters of aesthetic autobiography. who also overcame their predicaments during and through moments of epiphany. This paper will consider then the various usages of epiphany in the report and will examine their function in relation with the religious and the creative predicaments suffered by the fictional Kazantzakis. I hope that in the article I will talk a bit about the personal predicament and the existential predicaments as well. Additionally, it will show that in employing the trope of epiphany, Kazantzakis integrates it with and adapts it to his personal credo and system of thought. Ultimately, this paper will demonstrate that in the report, Kazantzakis secularizes epiphany by mocking and renouncing divine epiphany as a means of salvation in favor of secular epiphany, which he employs to attain redemption. Following the initial religious crisis Kazantzakis suffers in Crete as an adolescent as a result of the loss of his faith, as an adult he experiences an existential/religious predicament immediately after his return to Athens from Italy. In chapter 19 of the report, we encounter, I quote, a heavily ill, varia arostos, Kazantzakis, tormented by metaphysical questions such as the meaning of life in general and the purpose of his life in particular. His decision to visit Mount Athos together with his friend Angelos Ikeianos must be closely connected with the existential/metaphysical crisis he undergoes. From his journals, we know that the real Kazantzakis suffered a full religious crisis, as Peter Bean indicates, at Mount Athos. In the report, though, the character called Kazantzakis does not undergo any such crisis, but simply appears in search of something, a sign, which might help him to confirm his hesitant yearning to become a monk and thus reach God through what might be called via negativa. The object of his search becomes clear in a dialogue he has with a Cretan monk. "When will I also see God?" Kazantzakis asks the monk. And the monk replies, "It's easy, very easy. Open your eyes and you will see him." The implication behind the monk's reply is that the epiphanic potential is constantly available to Kazantzakis. He's unable to grasp it, though, and so one could speak of a frustrated, thwarted, even missed divine epiphany on his part. While at the Philotheo monastery, Kazantzakis and Sikeianos fail to perceive God for a second time. "Look carefully into the Virgin's eyes," said the monk who accompanied them. "What do you see there?" "Nothing," they both answered. "Whoever has faith sees Christ crucified," replied the monk, casting a stern glance at them. A stern glance, I'm sorry. In this case, divine manifestation seems to be dependent on the believer's faith. In other words, without faith, God cannot be perceived, being available only to believers. Kazantzakis soon finds out, though, from a monk at the monastery of Dionysiou and from the hermit Makarios Espelioti, that skeptics like himself, wishing nonetheless to reach God, can do so through asceticism. But neither Kazantzakis nor Sikeianos are ready to take up via negativa, and so their search for a divine epiphany turns out to be unfruitful. Indeed, God does not manifest himself to them, just as he did not appear to the fictional characters of Kazantzakis' early work titled Comedy, a one-act of tragedy. But unlike the characters of this early work, who end up disillusioned once they find out that God does not exist, at Mount Athos, Kazantzakis has not yet declared that God is an illusion, but keeps seeking him. And though he's not ready to take up via negativa to reach him, he continues exploring other ways through which he can perceive God. In fact, with the help of a monk named Ignatius, Kazantzakis soon discovers that one can also grasp God by way of the senses. Ignatius confesses to Kazantzakis that he once perceived God during sexual intercourse and felt that he was in complete unison with him. The monk goes on to admit that it was only through sexual intercourse, not through prayer and asceticism, that he managed to see God. Ignatius' confession acts as a catalyst in Kazantzakis' tormented psyche. It helps him make up his mind to leave Athos, abandoning his yearning to become a monk. Kazantzakis crowns his decision with a famous haiku about the almond tree, which he puts in the mouth of Sikeyanos at the end of the chapter. I said to the almond tree, "Sister, speak to me of God," and the almond tree blossomed. Privileging via positiva over via negativa, the haiku serves to confirm Kazantzakis' discovery that God can be grasped through the senses, in this case through one's capacity to appreciate beauty. Chapter 20, titled Jerusalem, opens with a retrospective epiphany of Christ in the form of a homeless, exiled, hungry, completely helpless figure, suddenly perceived by Kazantzakis upon reflecting on his experiences at Mount Athos. Like Odysseus, who fails to immediately recognize the goddess Athena when she manifests herself to him, Kazantzakis too fails to directly recognize the homeless, exiled, hungry Christ upon first seeing him at Mount Athos. Blending paganism with Christianity, he compares Christ's pitiful state to that of Athena, who also found herself exiled from her temple in the 5th century Common Era, when belief in the pagan gods had waned. Again, what is implied here is that Kazantzakis fails to recognize Christ because his faith is tainted with suspicion, if not outright disbelief. He wishes, though, that Christ will appear to him and seek his help, just as Athena appeared to the Neoplatonic philosopher Proclus, seeking refuge in his forehead. At first glance, one might claim that during this retrospective epiphany, of Christ serves as a confirmation of Kazantzakis' renewed sense of piety. Yet upon a closer, more guarded reading, one realizes that Kazantzakis has just set in motion the process of secularization of the Christian God, which in this case is to a large extent a process of humanization. By depicting Christ as completely powerless and in need of assistance, Kazantzakis divests him of his divine omnipotence. By presenting him as homeless and comparing him to Athena, Kazantzakis subjects Christ to the forces of history, that is, to the forces of evolution traditionally transcended by Christ's divine nature. Specifically, the waning of man's faith in Christ turns him into a homeless, exiled God, suffering the same fate of the pagan gods. Such a powerless Christ, completely stripped of his divine omnipotence, needs man's help in order to be redeemed, Kazantzakis proclaims. As he puts it, I quote, "Returning from Mount Athos, I felt, for the first time, that Christ wanders about hungry and homeless, that he is in dangers, and that now it is his turn to be saved by men." Based on this statement, I would call this epiphany, this retrospective epiphany, an epiphany of Salvadore's Day. From this point onwards, Kazantzakis' own redemption depends upon his ability to redeem Christ, and to this end, he resolves to visit Jerusalem and Mount Sinai. In Palestine, instead of seeing God, Kazantzakis experiences a series of frustrated divine epiphanies alongside some sinister secular epiphanies. On the road to the Dead Sea, where the two sinful cities of Sodom and Gomorrah perished, in vain Kazantzakis calls God to appear to him. Instead of seeing him in all his glory, he experiences a secular epiphany of a wrathful God in the form of a sudden realization triggered by the sign left behind when he appeared to the people of Sodom and Gomorrah, namely the two perished cities in the bottom of the Dead Sea. This sinister epiphany of the Old Testament God is followed by an epiphany of a rebellious Lot, who, in a complete inversion of the biblical story, freely chooses to stay and perish along with the sinful cities rather than run away and save himself. Alarmed at his own defiant epiphanic imagination, which gives rise to such blasphemous epiphanies, Kazantzakis wishes that he manages to cleanse himself from his own demons so he can eventually realize his childhood yearning to become a monk. Back in Jerusalem, his religious predicament starts manifesting itself at night in the form of nightmares. To relieve himself, Kazantzakis decides to walk around the city. Whilst peregrinating, the unexpected sight of an old engraving of Mount Sinai displayed behind a shop window suddenly triggers in him a secular epiphany that takes the form of a decision to visit Sinai in the hope that he will encounter God there, or will simply hear his voice. God's divine manifestation, he believes, will show him the way out of his religious predicament. Chapter 21 outlines Kazantzakis' repeated attempts to see or hear God's voice at Mount Sinai. Yet once again, all his efforts turn out to be fruitless, despite the fact that he now treats the same space once trodden by the Old Testament God. Mount Sinai, the mount trodden by God, το Θεοβάδιστον όρος, as he recurrently refers to it, can be characterized as a theophanic space par excellence, in the sense that Kazantzakis perceives it as brimming with signs of Jehovah's different manifestations to Moses, the prophets, and the Hebrew people. Reflecting on the various forms that his divine epiphanies took, Kazantzakis observes that the Old Testament God at first revealed himself as wind, earthquake, fire, and a column of smoke to his people, until he gradually became more civilized and appeared to them in the form of a soft breeze. Ultimately, in the New Testament, he appeared as, quote, pacific, non-demanding, and jolly, like a fine human being, end of quote. Though Kazantzakis' reflections on the different forms of God's divine manifestations initially give the impression of a believer in search of God, a second reading suggests that he has again set in motion the process of secularization. By depicting Jehovah's form as gradually changing over time, Kazantzakis in effect historicizes him, suggesting that the erstwhile unchanging God evolves and is, just like any other historical entity, subject to the forces of history, namely to the forces of evolution and change. While treating God as any other historical agent, Kazantzakis, in a last desperate effort to perceive him, sets out to climb the holy summit, the place where Moses, quote, saw God face to face, enopios enopio, and spoke with him. After all, God descended on Mount Sinai, and he still inhabits it. Kazantzakis finds out from Father Agapios and Pachomios, his two companions, in the ascent of the holy summit, who draw for him a picture of God not only as transcendent, but also as immanent. Yet even atop the holy summit, Kazantzakis fails to experience an epiphany of God. What's more, Father Agapios recommends to him to stop trying to see God, otherwise he will lose his eyesight. In a syncretist fashion, Father Agapios connects the Christian God with a well-known pagan belief, according to which if someone sees a pagan God in his true form, he or she risks suffering some kind of physical punishment. That was, after all, the fate of the blind prophet Tiresias, who stumbled upon the goddess Athena when she was bathing naked. Back in the monastery of St. Catherine in the desert, Kazantzakis gradually begins to feel that he is not tormented any longer by the old metaphysical questions about the meaning and purpose of life, which had rendered him heavily ill in Athens. Now he feels completely redeemed, despite the fact that he did not manage to see God at Mount Sinai, to find that is a confirmation of his existence he was looking for. I quote, "With the passage of the days in this godly isolation, my heart grew calm. It seemed to fill with answers. I did not ask any questions anymore. I was certain. Everything was everything, where we come from, where we're going, what our purpose on earth, struck me as extremely sure and simple in this God-trodden isolation. Little by little, my blood took on the godly rhythm." Kazantzakis' painfully attained redemption is not meant to last, though. An unexpected meeting with the fairly unconventional monk Father Joachim will soon disrupt it. In an ironical twist, Father Joachim advises Kazantzakis never to stop struggling with God because this is the best possible ascesis. Father Joachim further shares with Kazantzakis his meta-Christian credo, according to which one day Christianity will embrace not only man's soul, but also his body, and it will preach that God and the devil are not enemies, but fellow workers. Father Joachim's words serve as a catalyst in Kazantzakis' tormented by the fruitless search of the God soul. He resolves to stop looking for God in the desert and to seek him instead in the world. Thus ends his second attempt to become a monk and begins his search of God through what might be called secular mysticism. Kazantzakis returns to the world, which from now on he calls monastery. I quote, "The world is our monastery. The true monk, he who lives with men and works with God here, in contact with the soil. God does not sit on a throne above the clouds. He wrestles here on earth along with us." End of quote. His first stop is his homeland, Crete. Touring around the Cretan villages, Kazantzakis observes that the Cretan Orthodox priests are, I quote, "uncultivated, their education meager. They're incapable of any theoretical discussion of Christian doctrine, but Christ lives in their hearts, and sometimes they see him with their eyes, if not by the pillow of a wartime casualty, then sitting beneath a flowering almond tree in springtime." What proved impossible for Kazantzakis, namely to experience an epiphany of Christ, is possible for the simple and cultivated Cretan priests. Indeed, just like the simple people were able to perceive Christ's divinity, likewise the uneducated Cretan priests can also see Christ. The implication again is that they managed to do so because, unlike Kazantzakis' faith, theirs is untainted by skepticism or doubt. From Crete, Kazantzakis heads to Paris, which he now proclaims, quote, "the new face of God." However, instead of encountering God in Paris, he encounters his killer, Nietzsche, the modern philosopher who proclaimed the death of God, and whom Kazantzakis calls great martyr. Although the prospect of a dead God and of a godless universe that Nietzsche envisaged strips man of any hope, Kazantzakis soon realizes, he prefers this prospect to a false hope. In fact, Kazantzakis welcomes this prospect as liberating because it allows man to reach his full potential, to become, that is, Nietzschean Superman. But Kazantzakis does not go as far as to embrace Superman's unlimited and uncontrolled power, because it brings about disaster, he suddenly realizes during a sinister epiphany of war he experiences in the middle of a public park in Paris. In this epiphany, Nietzsche appears and sits next to him, while planes loaded with bombs fly above their heads, darkening the Parisian sky and signaling the onset of World War I. While Nietzsche confesses to the fictional Kazantzakis that this is what he hoped for when he created Superman, Kazantzakis, unlike his mentor, clearly refrains from embracing war and violence. Having written the report after the end of the two world wars, that is, with the valuable historical lessons learned from these wars in mind, Kazantzakis decidedly renounces violence in this otherwise Nietzschean epiphany. While still in Paris, he goes on to experience a second epiphany of Nietzsche during his last visit to Notre Dame. There, while contemplating and admiring the impressive Gothic architecture of the Catholic cathedral and its upward arrow-like movement, impressive movement, he suddenly perceives Nietzsche as, I quote, "an arrow darting to the sky, a lightning rod meant to seize God and pull him down from his throne," end of quote. In a typical postmodern mocking fashion, Kazantzakis experiences a secular, a believer might even say a blasphemous, epiphany of the death of God and its killer in the middle of the sacred space of the Christian cathedral. As he informs us, the Epiphany on the one hand functions as a remedy for his tormented by the Christian God psyche, healing him from the wounds of the crucifixion, while on the other it functions as a poison, making his soul bloody and rebellious. Evidently, a new predicament starts for him, from which he will be redeemed through a new epiphany that will take him beyond Nietzsche's heavy shadow. Communism and Russia seem to be the next stations of the journey. In Russia, Kazantzakis encounters the new secular religion of communism that comes to replace Christianity soon after the Christian God has been proclaimed dead by Nietzsche. While attending a ceremony at the Red Square in Moscow on the occasion of the birth of the Russian Revolution, he experiences a secular epiphany of human solidarity triggered by the presence of numerous different people who have come to Moscow from all over the world, being united under the banner of the new religion of communism. I quote, "I look around me. Everyone is weeping. I look again, but see nothing. My eyes have been dimmed by tears like all the rest. Falling upon the slender Chinese general at my side, I hug him as tightly as I can, and we both weep. The Negro dashes forward and clasps the two of us in his arms. He is weeping too, and laughing. How many hours did this divine intoxication last? How many centuries? This was the second great day in my life, the loftiest of all. The first was when Prince George of the Hellenes set foot on Cretan soil. As I squeezed the Chinese general in my arms, as the Negro squeezed the two of us, I felt that boundaries were crumbling away, that names, countries, and races were vanishing. Weeping, laughing, embracing, man was uniting with man. A lightning flash had illuminated their minds, and they had seen, all men are brothers." What's interesting about the above epiphany is that from a subjective spiritual manifestation initially felt only by Kazantzakis, it becomes a collective one towards the end of the excerpt, in a fashion consistent with communism's universalist claims. Suddenly everybody is illuminated and experiences the same sense of brotherhood. Kazantzakis' intoxication with the new religion of communism does not last, though. It is just one more station in the journey of his life, a journey of ascent, as he repeatedly points out in the report. The next and final station of the journey is of an eschatological/aesthetic nature, which, with Odysseus becoming his new guide, his fictional son, and also his alter ego. Yet before Kazantzakis comes to realize what the next station will be, he suffers from a prolonged creative predicament which verges on what might be called a creative crisis. The crisis lasts several months, during which Kazantzakis is tormented by feelings of restlessness and insomnia. To alleviate himself, he decides to travel in the Aegean, knowing that there is nothing he can do to expedite the slow gestation process preceding creative inspiration. Soon the trip is over, and one day, quite unexpectedly, he wakes up realizing that Christ, Buddha, and Lenin were only stations of his journey. Their role was to function, quote, as beaters who will help him flush the cry, end of quote. This realization enables Kazantzakis to understand that all his, and I start quoting, all his wanderings were joining in harmony now, being compressed into a single all-precious journey, which knew full well whence it had set out, why, and where it was going. Each stopping point was not a meaningless whim of chance, but rather the application of destiny's plan. All my journeys had become a red line beginning from man and ascending in order to reach God, in other words, the supreme summit of hope. The above realization is followed by a secular epiphany, during which Kazantzakis perceives the face of the great fellow voyager whom he was seeking all this period. Unlike Christ, whom he failed to immediately recognize at Mount Athos, he immediately recognizes the fellow voyager. It is Odysseus. His epiphany is triggered by an act of writing undertaken by Kazantzakis, during which the blank paper becomes a mirror in which he suddenly sees the reflection of Odysseus' face. The epiphany serves to redeem Kazantzakis from his predicament and to mark the end of his creative crisis. In the last chapter of the report, The Cretan Glance, Kazantzakis experiences 3 more secular epiphanies. He senses the first whilst gazing at the frescoes at Knossos and reflecting on the hidden meaning of the bullfights. Suddenly, he realizes that the bullfights suggest the transubstantiation of the horror of death into an exalted game by the transubstantiation by the Minons of the horror of death into an exalted game. This initial epiphany triggers in his consciousness a second epiphany. I quote, "And suddenly the answer invaded my mind, and not only my mind, but also my heart and loins. This was what I had been seeking, what I wanted. I had to fill the eyes of my own Odysseus with his Cretan glance." End of quote. The epiphany of the Cretan glance is not only redeeming for Kazantzakis, it is also life-changing. As he puts it, quote, "My life changed from that day onward, the day of the Cretan glance, as I named it. My soul discovered where to stand and how to cast its gaze. The terrible problems tormenting me grew calm. They smiled, as though springtime had come, and the wild perplexities, like vernal thorns, had been covered with flowers. It was a tardy, unforeseen juvenescence." Redeemed from his creative predicament, Kazantzakis is now ready to be redeemed from redemption too, with Odysseus' help. As it is to be expected by now, he manages to take that final step through a secular epiphany during which he sees Odysseus again. Now, however, Odysseus does not appear to him as a reflection in the paper that has become a mirror, but in his human form, wearing his characteristic pointed cap and sweating in a full celebration of his bodily materiality. During the epiphany, Odysseus helps Kazantzakis take the last and most difficult step of the journey, that is to redeem himself from redemption and thus move beyond freedom itself. When Kazantzakis replies that he's afraid to take that step, Odysseus reassures him that it is okay, since he has accomplished his duty on earth by creating a son greater than himself. Odysseus, Kazantzakis' fictional son, informs his father that he will undertake this difficult step for him. He then kisses Kazantzakis, bids adieu to him, and disappears in the pitch darkness. Thus, at the end, Kazantzakis vicariously experiences the epiphany of freedom from redemption through his fictional son, Odysseus, who is also his alter ego. To conclude, what I hope has become clear by now is that the primary function of epiphany in the report from a narratological perspective is to help Kazantzakis overcome the different predicaments he suffers from in the course of the journey and thus propel him from one station to the next until he reaches the final one. From a psychological perspective, epiphany functions as a mechanism of inner redemption, enabling Kazantzakis to overcome trauma by investing his life with new meaning. From a philosophical perspective, epiphany functions as a tool of evolution, allowing Kazantzakis to overcome inertia and stagnation. And from a phenomenological perspective, it could be argued that epiphany functions as a luminous interval, to recall the well-chosen title of today's symposium, or as a lighthouse, to recall the title of Virginia Woolf's epiphanic novel, casting its bright light on a dark or dimly lit life course marked by constant predicaments and struggle. Thank you.
You've given us a very